people of Earth, and hello, Murray Griffin. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Francisca Curran. And I want to start by asking you to say a phrase, which I know you've been saying quite a bit this morning, a tongue twister, which for all you podcasters out there, I think I highly recommend this phrase.
It's very important to warm up, isn't it?
Yes, it is important to warm up.
So the phrase that I've been working on, which imagine if you get it wrong when you're trying. Okay. There's an inevitable limit when there's cinnamon in it. There's an inevitable limit when there's cinnamon in it. And that's sort of,
That's absolutely brilliant. I'm really impressed by that. And I'm
warmed up.
I'm going to be practicing it ahead of next week's episode.
Well, shall we get into things? Maybe would you like to start with your pick of the week? What stood out to you in the newsletter this week, Murray?
Yes. So my pick of the week this week is a new paper that's been issued by the Queensland government, and it's on environmental offsets. Now, environmental offsets are supposed to be used to compensate for unavoidable damage to native habitat and plants and animals, and that's damage that's caused by new developments or by land clearing. And ideally how they work is that the developer invests in project on a nearby site that give better protection to exactly the same species or ecosystems that are going to be harmed by their development. But although that's the ideal, it often doesn't work that way in practice. For example, it can be hard for developers to find like-for-like environmental offset projects that result in the species that their project is harming being better off overall. And a lot of developers in Queensland have basically just taken the easy way out and paid money into a Queensland offset fund that's supposed to fund the environmental offset projects on their behalf. The trouble with that is that the Queensland government is having the same trouble basically as the developers in finding suitable offset projects. And as well, the way in which payments that a developer has to make into the fund, the way those amounts are calculated is out of date. So the fund isn't raising enough money to support offset projects, and at the same time it's having problems finding projects to spend the money on. So that's the sort of background. It is, yes, very tricky, very messy.
I've heard a few criticisms of it, but tell us more about the reform proposals.
Yeah, so still up for discussion, but there's some very clear ideas about what they want to do to, sort this mess out. And some of the changes proposed in the paper are quite basic. For example, the government's planning to use legislative reforms to make it clear that environmental offsets are only to be used as a last resort once all reasonable steps have been taken to avoid environmental impacts, to directly avoid the environmental impacts in the first place. And I mean, that's kind of offsetting 101.
In general, in that carbon side as well,
Yeah, where offsets is not your sort of go-to measure. And then the government's also going to put in place measures so that environmental offsets can be secured for major government projects before those projects actually get underway. So you're not sort of going through the motions of looking for offset projects, years after the project's actually finished. And it's going to overhaul the financial settlement offset calculator, which is what's used to work out how much developers should pay into the government's offset account. And that hasn't been updated since 2014, which is a real problem. So those are the big changes. And I think the really interesting thing about these reforms is that they've clearly been triggered by the environmental law reforms.
EPBC.
Yeah, exactly. The EPBC reforms.
Reforms last year, yeah.
The EPBC Act reforms made last year. And the Queensland government, basically it wants to be aligned with the federal reforms because it wants a bilateral agreement so that it can approve projects on behalf of the federal government. Really interesting. So that was my pick of the week. And what was yours?
My pick of the week maybe wasn't, maybe not the most interesting for everyone, but I think it's a really important one, and it's also land-based. And so this is the Australian Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry putting out a discussion paper recently to get feedback on the regulation of options that inhibit emissions in mostly livestock.
Oh,
So
Yep.
here we're talking about the burping and farting of cattle and sheep, if I can
Yep.
say that, and inhibiting the methane as well as nitrification inhibitors that obviously have implications on waterways. Firstly, this is really important because the methane from livestock makes up most of Australia's agricultural emissions and about 13% of Australia's total emissions. So this one source, well, from many, many cows and sheep, is a huge dent in our inventory. That if we can make a dent in that, we can make a huge impact on Australia's emissions. And some of these options, these feed additive options that get added to the feed of the cattle, can reduce their methane emissions by up to 98% in ideal conditions. So this can have a huge impact. So basically, the department is saying that these inhibitors that can reduce methane and nitrification can have a huge impact, but they need to be regulated appropriately. So this discussion paper asks for input on various aspects of that. I think it's a step in the right direction, an important and interesting one. Many different many different additives have been explored and developed and researched over the last few years, and it's good to see that things might be ramping up in use soon.
And seaweed, I think seaweed is one of them.
That's right. Asparagopsis is a kind. I think it's a red algae seaweed that is one of the supplements or additives that can be put into the feed of cattle to reduce methane. I think it interrupts the production of methane, which is obviously one of the most harmful greenhouse gases that we have that contributes to our emissions.
Yeah, I wonder how they sort of discovered that.
I do think about this, like how hard is it? I mean, it's not a simple and easy process to monitor emissions coming from livestock.
Now, before we get on to the other news of the week, a quiz question. we have a quiz question, Francisca. In fact, it's the same quiz question we had last week.
That we asked last week.
Yeah, but we forgot to answer it.
Suspense, weren't we? We were creating suspense. We thought if they make it to the end of that episode, let's see if they'll come back next week for the answer.
Yes.
Our quiz question was about farming and climate change as well. It is, which food is the most polluting in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas it releases per kilogram produced? Is it olive oil, chocolate, peas, or root vegetables? Stay tuned this episode to find out.
Yes, well, I'm hoping it's root vegetables because, frankly, I could do without those, except for potatoes, as long as it's not potatoes.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, it's ridiculous, Murray. Who can live without root vegetables? No.
Yes, well, anyway.
But I'm also not giving up chocolate, so.
No, exactly. I know, it's very, there's a lot hanging on the answer to this question. All right, so.
Alrighty.
Now, we did talk about farming, and in other farm news, the Australian government's planning on introducing legislation to encourage competition in providing farm machinery repair services. Now, you might think, well, what's this got to do with the environment? But, well, what it's designed to do is to make sure repairs aren't unnecessarily expensive. And that will also help to ensure that farmers can use their machinery for longer. And it will also make it harder for dealers in new equipment to use excessive repairs pricing to encourage farmers to buy new equipment when their old equipment could just be fixed. So the proposed legislation is out for comment at the moment, and it's been warmly welcomed by the National Farmers Federation, which doesn't always give a warm welcome to Australian government legislative proposals, let's be honest.
Let's leave the farm now and hit the open road. So Australia's Green Bank, known as the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or CEFC, has committed up to $10 million to support the deployment of more than 100 SunSwap endurance truck refrigeration units. So most truck refrigeration units rely on diesel engines to keep products cool, but these SunSwap units are fully electric and solar assisted by panels which are on the top of each unit. And so just a reminder, the CEFC doesn't give grants. Instead, this $10 million will be lent to SunSwap on generous terms to help it roll out more electric refrigeration units at a faster rate. But SunSwap will eventually have to pay back the money. And so here's a short clip from Grant Turner of ProTrans Solutions, which specialises in refrigerated truck units and is the Australian distributor of SunSwap units. Let's give it a listen.
Hi, I'm Grant Turner, ProTran Solutions Australia. We have the SunSwap Endurance unit here behind me, full battery electric charged by solar. I'm excited to announce the Wickham Freight Lines are the first to purchase in Australia. Congratulations, Wickham crew.
And there's more federal funding going Queensland's way, with Australia's Environment Minister Murray Watt announcing an extra $91.8 million for measures to help protect the Great Barrier Reef. As well, in the last show we mentioned yellow crazy ants, didn't we, Francisca?
We did, which I had to Google to see,
Yes.
How crazy and how yellow are they?
Yeah, well, me too. I had to do the same thing. Last week, Murray Watt clarified that an extra $6 million over the next 2 years would go towards the fight to eradicate yellow crazy ant infestations in the Cairns region. Yellow crazy ants, they're actually no laughing matter. They can form absolutely massive colonies, and they're listed on as one of the world's 100 worst invasive species by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They've also caused a huge amount of destruction on Christmas Island, causing the deaths of many of the island's famous red crabs, as well as its other unique species. The money for yellow crazy ants is important because Queensland's wet tropics is ideal habitat for the ants, and the Wet Tropics Management Authority already has runs on the board in trying to get rid of them. It's so far declared more than 1,200 hectares free of yellow crazy ants, including 63 hectares located within the World Heritage Area.
The Australian government has released a new research report on decarbonising commercial building. The good news is that the report concludes that decarbonising the built environment is possible using technologies that are commercially available, and the sector is seen as an opportunity for early action. The not so good news is that the report also concludes that strategies based on giving owners of office blocks and the like grants or rebates for clean energy upgrades and so on doesn't seem to work that well. And it says that governments around the world have reached similar conclusions. According to the paper, internationally, policy measures are moving towards regulation to create drivers for asset owners to upgrade their buildings. It mentions a European Union Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that sets minimum energy performance standards for commercial buildings, and which also seeks to create a phased wave of building renovations to make the EU's commercial building stock compatible with net zero emissions by 2050. The EU policy will also require installation of solar energy technology on an increasing number of buildings. The report also points out that in Singapore, building energy performance is benchmarked, and building owners must create an energy efficiency improvement plan and implement its recommendations within 3 years.
It sounds like we need a little bit of green tape, doesn't it, Francisca?
It does sound like it. And this, I think this report, this research report, is really important to have everything up to date and, in one place and speaking specifically to the Australian context. Not a lot of the things in there surprised me, though. But there were some good suggestions on government's sort of interventions that could be made on a high level sense.
Okay.
So hopefully some of those move forward.
Let's talk koalas and fish. So first up, koalas. And the Australian government has released a video about a cultural burn managed by Indigenous Australians and conducted on the New South Wales North Coast to help restore koala habitat. Traditional custodians and project partners worked together on the managed burn at Nalu, a privately owned property near Coffs Harbour. Here's some of the audio from a really interesting video clip about the project.
So we've tried to, wherever possible, involve First Nation people in the management of the property, and in particular with regard to controlling African grasses, introduced cattle grasses. Once we've stopped the seeding cycle of those African grasses, then there's every likelihood that native species will bounce out of the ground.
Today's end result was about coming together and sharing knowledge for a cool burn to help rejuvenate our landscape. At the moment, this area was just all old paddock grasslands, and we want to revitalise this back into the old rainforest that it once was. With these cool burns, low intensity burn, the idea is to keep a low heat fire going across the landscape to protect our environment, our trees, our wildlife. And this little nest here is from a grass warbler. It's a great example. Fire has gone straight over the top of it, burnt ground all the way around at a low intensity heat. This is perfect in condition, intact, with a small singe on top where there was just a bit of dead grass. The nest itself is still wet, And it's a great example of why we do those cool burns. The bird itself has had a chance to escape, but it's probably not going to come back for this area for a couple of weeks or so yet.
Now on to fish, and in particular, one of Australia's most iconic fish species, the Murray cod.
Great name.
Great name. The government has announced it plans to boost minimum winter environmental flows from Menady Lakes into the lower Darling or Bucka River from about 200 megalitres per day to about 400 megalitres per day. Fish scientists describe this higher flow as a recovery base flow that is designed to support the survival of young fish, especially the Murray cod. This sort of thing is important because over the past decade, the river has been under a lot of stress, which in turn has caused a sharp drop in native fish numbers. At times, flow has stopped completely, sometimes for more than a year. There have been major fish kills and water quality has been poor. As a result, Murray cod populations are still what the Australian government describes as fragile, although recent monitoring has revealed some positive signs.
The New South Wales government has released a biodiversity impact report focused on conservation activities on private land that have been supported by the state's Biodiversity Conservation Trust. The report covers the years 2018 to 2025, and it shows that private landholders who have Biodiversity Conservation Trust agreements have contributed nearly 40% of the total area that's been added to New South Wales Protected Area Network in those years. It's an amazing statistic, and so
Yeah, amazing.
I had no idea it was that large.
Me neither.
So yeah,
It's
thanks.
real impactful.
Yeah, thanks to all those landholders. The report says the Biodiversity Conservation Trust and participating landholders have also prevented the loss of about 35,000 hectares of native vegetation. They've also protected habitat for at least 304 threatened species, and they've helped to safeguard 41 threatened ecological communities. Landholders participating in the Biodiversity Conservation Trust program manage their properties for conservation in exchange for annual payments, and they work with expert ecologists who track environmental changes on their sites over time.
That is wonderful and, broad participatory involvement. And I don't want to bring everything back to carbon, but if you're preventing the loss of 35,000 hectares of native vegetation, that will have an impact on our national inventory in a reasonable way.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Victorian Government's advisory body on infrastructure has released a new report that warns that the state's infrastructure faces a rapidly escalating risk landscape driven by climate change. The report by Infrastructure Victoria is the largest analysis ever done of the climate risks to the Victorian government-owned and regulated infrastructure. It looks at $318 billion worth of assets across Victoria and the risks that they face from 7 different extreme weather events. The report finds that more than $57 billion of Victorian government-owned or regulated infrastructure is at risk of damage or destruction from extreme weather. And in the next 40 years, the value at risk could be more than $71 billion. So these are very big numbers and a really important study to have released into the public domain.
Yep. Steelmaker Infrabuilt has confirmed that its Laverton facility in Western Melbourne is now contracting sufficient renewable electricity to meet up to 50% of its electricity needs. The Laverton Power Purchase Agreement with the Victorian Wind Farm augments Infrabuilt's existing 25% renewable energy agreement at its Sydney Steel Mill and Newcastle Rod Mill in New South Wales. The agreements form part of Infrabuilt's efforts to be fully reliant on renewable electricity across all its manufacturing sites by 2030. Infrabuilt is also planning to secure supplies of biomethane as a replacement for fossil gas in parts of the Laverton mill that can't readily be electrified.
Murray, I'm pretty sure that the Laverton Infrabuilt steel mill is one of the facilities covered by the safeguard mechanism. And I'll take any excuse to bring up the safeguard mechanism and also highlight that there's an upcoming Track Changes podcast episode unpacking recent data on the safeguard mechanism coming up. And
Yes.
It's great to see initiatives like the displacement of fossil gas with biomethane happening at a safeguard facility.
Yeah, Absolutely.
The Tasmanian Parliament's Joint Select Committee on Energy Matters has released its interim report on energy prices and related matters. The report says that while Tasmania has among the lowest electricity tariffs in Australia, this does not reflect the lived experience of many Tasmanians when paying their electricity bills. The report says that higher household consumption, driven by the state's cold climate, ageing and poorly insulated housing stock, and high reliance on electric heating means that Tasmanian households face among the highest electricity bills in the country. And this is a shameful statistic. The committee says that it received evidence that about 50,000 Tasmanian households are experiencing energy poverty. The interim report recommends a review of Tasmania's minimum energy efficiency standards for rental properties to ensure that they meet modern expectations. And it recommends working with the federal government to deliver programs that improve the energy efficiency of public and private rental properties, including insulation and heating. Now, one piece of good news is that the Australian and Tasmanian governments haven't been waiting on this report to act. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, the Australian government is providing an extra $14.6 million to upgrade social housing properties in Tasmania. It's doing so under a federal program that's got a very long-winded name, the Social Housing Energy Performance Initiative, or SHEPI for short. And in fact, the Australian and Tasmanian governments had previously spent $8.3 million under the program for energy upgrades to 1,700 properties. And in other SHEPI news, the Australian government is also providing $120.3 million under the program to support energy upgrades at an additional 8,000 social and community housing homes in Victoria. The new Victorian commitment comes on top of previous SHEPI funding to the state that has supported upgrades for almost 3,500 Victorian homes.
Yes, and since you took the opportunity of InfraBuild to talk about the safeguard mechanism, I am going to this is a slightly shallower perspective, but given my interest in climate change communications, I'm just going to say the name of that program is just terrible. Yeah, like Social Housing Energy Performance Initiative. Clearly, it's not something that they ran by Public Affairs before.
Mo, would you want to sort of pitch a rebrand? What would you pitch it as? What potential has the program got?
Well, I don't. Yeah, no, I can't think. Nothing comes to mind offhand. You know, communications doesn't work like that, Francisco. It's not just a sort of snap of the fingers thing.
Okay, what about the HEAPS initiative, the Housing, Energy and Performance Social Initiative?
I love that. Yeah, HEAPS. HEAPS good. Yeah, no, there's a lot you can work with that really well.
The HEAPS good Tasmania.
Yeah,
maybe. We'll workshop it.
Yeah.
We'll workshop it.
Yeah. Anyway, so if they're going to rebrand that program, they should give us a call. Now, the Northern Territory EPA is asking for comments related to the environmental impact statements for 3 interrelated carbon capture and storage projects proposed by fossil gas company INPEX. The Ichthus CCS Preparedness Project, I feel like I should have practiced your tongue twister for that one. What was the tongue twister again?
It's not too late. There's an inevitable limit when there's cinnamon. And it's not my tongue twister. I can't claim responsibility for this.
There's an inevitable limit when there's cinnamon in it. Okay, and now I go
back. There's an inevitable limit when there's carbon capture and storage in it.
Yes. Yeah. The Ichthus CCS Preparedness Project would establish a CO2 compression and export system at INPEX's Ichthus LNG plant on Bladen Point in Darwin. The second project, the Ichthus Carbon Capture and Storage Project, would be a buried onshore pipeline system between the Ichthus LNG plant and the inlet to a longer pipeline to the sequestration site. And finally, the third element, the Bonaparte Carbon Capture and Storage Project, would involve the construction of a 90-kilometre pipeline running from Darwin Harbour to the boundary of the Northern Territory's coastal waters. The projects would take CO2 from a range of industrial customers in Darwin for sequestration in Commonwealth waters, with startup provisionally scheduled for 2031. INPEX says the potential storage site could sequester more than 300 million tonnes of CO2, sequestered at the rate of 10 million tonnes annually. And INPEX isn't just interested in storing carbon dioxide from industries in Darwin. It's also interested in storing CO2 imported from across the Asia Pacific.
It's a big worry. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, CCS, it's a hot button issue. CCS, isn't it, Francisco?
It is. It's a very interesting one. Let's talk now about big wind and solar, Murray. And there's so much to say. There's important developments at the national level, as well as in New South Wales, Northern Territory and Queensland. Let's start with New South Wales. And with one particular wind project, Iberdrola's proposed 247 megawatt Mullion Creek wind farm, which would be located in a state government-owned softwood pine plantation near Orange. Iberdrola's EPBC environmental documentation has been released for this project, which would consist of up to 33 turbines. The wind farm would create up to 250 construction jobs. Now, based on the project size, it would have to make community benefit payments totaling about $210,000 each and every year that it operates. And that's on top of the payments it would make to state forests as the owner of the land hosting the turbines. So that's basically at the standard price. But the thing we really like about this project is that Iberdrola has done a terrific job in putting out written information on it. So we'll put a link to Iberdrola's FAQ about the project in the show notes, but it does a really good job of answering these very legitimate questions that people have about clean energy projects. It answers questions like, why don't the turbines spin all the time? And what's the carbon footprint of a wind turbine? How do they work? And will I be able to hear the turbines? And so on. And they've even prepared some virtual reality software so people can see the extent to which the turbines might be visible from their property, which is pretty amazing. You've had a good look through all of these, Murray?
I did have a good look.
What did you think?
Well, I just thought it was terrific because it took the concerns that we all hear so often about clean energy and it
addressed them straight up.
And it talked about them and gave really clear, concise answers. So very impressive. Great job by Iberdrola, I thought. And in other big New South Wales news, the state government has opened New South Wales' largest ever tender for new clean energy generation. The tender is aiming to support new clean energy generation projects with a total capacity of 2.5 gigawatts. Successful projects in the tender round won't be offered a grant. Instead, they'll be offered what's called a long-term electricity service agreement. Or LTESA, and I'm just going to say that suddenly Sheppy doesn't look so bad. And what LTESA does is that it allows developers of new generation projects to get support if their electricity market revenues fall below a pre-agreed floor. And because they have access to that benefit when times are tough, developers of the projects must also agree to partially repay any payments that they've received if their revenues rise above a pre-agreed level. So that gives the developers more certainty about their revenue, and it also reassures investors in their project, which means that more wind and solar farms can get built faster. And the New South Wales government isn't just going to tender for new wind and solar farms. At the same time, it's going to be conducting a separate tender for a massive amount of new grid-scale battery storage. And it's doing that because these big batteries play an important role in firming the supply we get from wind and solar by storing it when there's plenty of it and discharging it when it's needed.
Finally, in New South Wales, Ausgrid has completed stage 1 of its upgrade of network infrastructure in the Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone. The completed work will allow an extra 350 megawatts of new renewable energy capacity to connect the Hunter region. Completion of the entire project, which is scheduled to occur 2028, will allow about 1.8 gigawatts of new generation and storage to connect to the grid and will allow up to 1 gigawatt of capacity to be exported at any one time. And just a reminder, 1 gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, so that is a lot of electricity.
Yes. So moving up to Queensland, we don't really associate the current Queensland government with action on renewable energy, but last week there was a bit of an exception. The Queensland government issued a media release about 4 new grid-scale battery projects that have recently reached key milestones and will add another 940 megawatts of storage to the grid. According to the Queensland government, the battery projects are capable of powering nearly 1 million homes at times of peak demand.
Speaking of big renewables, this is really big. The Northern Territory EPA has invited comment on draft terms of reference for an environmental impact statement for Sun Cable's Muckaty solar project. The project would expand on Sun Cable's already approved AA Powerlink project, which would generate up to 6 gigawatts of clean energy for supply to industrial customers in Darwin and Singapore. The Sun Cable is expecting to make a final investment decision on the AA Powerlink project towards the end of 2027, with customers in Darwin receiving electricity from 2032. Sun Cable aims to have Muckaty approved before it makes a final investment decision on AA Powerlink. The Muckaty solar farm will be built in stages and would have up to 5 gigawatts of generating capacity, as well as 21.7 gigawatt hours of battery storage. Sun Cable is also investigating having data centres co-located with the solar farm.
And we saved the biggest for last. Australia's Climate Change and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, on the weekend announced 19 new clean energy projects that have been successful in the latest capacity investment scheme tender round. The 19 projects constitute the biggest single boost ever made to Australia's main electricity grid. The successful projects announced on the weekend will support 7.8 gigawatts of new wind and solar generation, as well as 7.9 gigawatt hours in grid-sized battery storage. All up, the 19 projects have agreed to make nearly $1.2 billion worth of community benefit payments to their host communities, and that's on top of any payments they make to hosting landowners. The projects will also create about 19,000 construction jobs, and they'll use more than $257 million worth of Australian steel. Like the New South Wales Energy Scheme, under the Capacity Investment Scheme, or CIS for short, successful projects don't get a grant. Instead, winning a CIS contract allows them to get support if their electricity market revenues fall below a pre-agreed floor. And because they have access to that benefit when times are tough, they must also agree to partially repay any payments they've received if their revenues rise above a pre-agreed level. Meanwhile, the Australian government isn't resting on its laurels. The next CIS tender has already opened and will target another 5 gigawatts of clean energy generation. And the new tender will also include a dedicated allocation for projects that involve First Nations communities.
Moving on a bit from the local renewables scene, and our last few news items are related to this year's COP31 Climate Summit. First up, recent comments from both Turkey and Australia, which will jointly host the COP31 summit, have made it clear that electrification will be an important theme of this year's summit. And we're likely to see a new global initiative on electrification emerge from COP31 summit. So that's the good news. But then there's some bad news too, Murray.
Well, yes, it's actually very disappointing. So, we've got worthy letters coming from Turkey and Australia. Well, there's now been 2 letters from the Turkish COP presidency that have been issued. The second one was co-written with Australia. And, they've been sort of worthy, but a bit bland, I would say. The bad news, though, that emerged last week is that Turkey abstained from a very important climate vote. Do you want to explain what that vote was, Francisca?
Yeah, Murray. So this was the UN General Assembly vote to pass a major UN resolution that backed the ICJ advisory opinion last year. So this is a building block to have that ICJ advisory opinion on climate change actualized within the UN. Yeah, and so around 140 countries passed this, 28 countries abstained from voting, and only 8 voted against it. And so in the 28 countries that abstained, one of those was Turkey.
Very disappointing. There's certainly some serious cause for concern given its decision to abstain from that vote. Let's talk about chocolate and root vegetables, Francisca.
And finally, Murray, the food that is most polluting out of olive oil, chocolate, peas and root vegetables in terms of greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions is unfortunately chocolate. But the good news is, Murray, that you eat chocolate in small portions. So, go ahead and eat as many potatoes as you want, but just have, that healthy portion of 2 pieces of chocolate.
Yeah, okay.
Of chocolate. That's it for today. You're all up to date. 2 more people are crucial to making this podcast happen: Sophie Sideris and the co-founder of the Earth News Service, Chris Danzy. To find out more about what we talked about today and other news of the week, check out the Earth newsletter at earthed.au. And if you support the Earth newsletter, you are also supporting this podcast. And if you enjoyed this pod, there's something we'd like you to do to help spread the word about it. Please share it with a friend, a colleague, or your network. And give us some stars on your pod listening platform. When Spotify and Apple see the stars or YouTube sees a thumbs up, they are more likely to put our pod in front of other people. Thank you and see you next time.
See you next Tuesday.